So it's going to be so much worse than they expect, the line that you gave to Axios. It's interesting, as you write here, 2 key changes in the Democratic mindset on Capitol Hill are going to result in a different look when it comes to oversight hearings if they win in the fall. How different?
Yeah, I think that's right. So look, one thing that will remain the same, companies are used to changes in oversight priorities when Congress changes. Republicans have had one corporate oversight priority. For example, they have tried to investigate companies for DEI programs. Democrats have much different priorities. And so that's always been true. So every time Democrats take back the House, you see them open investigations into drug pricing or consumer fraud or other alleged practices that are traditional core Democratic priorities. What's different this time is that, number one, a lot of Democrats on the Hill looked at the way the president has managed his relationship with corporate America over the past year and sees alleged corporate abuses or corporations aiding and abetting the Trump administration's biggest abuses of power. And so there is an increased demand among Democrats on the Hill to try to go after some companies that have either cut what they see as corrupt deals with the White House or have yielded to pressure from the White House. Look at the demands you've seen from the Hill already to investigate Paramount's transactions. Look at what's happened just in the past 48 hours at CBS. Those are all types of things that Democrats want to look into. The second key change is Democrats are very aware of the experience they had in 2019 and 2020, the last time there was a Democratic House and a Trump White House. And they came into office with all these plans to investigate the White House, investigate various cabinet agencies, and you saw them launch major investigations in the first months that they held gavels. And all of those investigations met with a stonewall, where in usual practice, White Houses and cabinet agencies would negotiate with Congress over what documents they would give, what they would withhold under executive privilege. This White House said no and gave nothing and forced Democrats into court. And what the White House, I think, figured out was you could put off those demands for years. And in many cases, executive branch documents weren't turned over until Trump was already gone. And so Democrats know that this time, if they want to actually get documents, it doesn't make sense to send a subpoena to the White House where you might get documents in 3 years when Trump is no longer president, when you can send it to a company and get documents in 3 weeks.
Just go to the other side of the transaction.
That's exactly right.
And an executive who is not even going to consider being held in criminal contempt of Congress, where the White House says, I dare you.
Yeah, I dare you. We can run it out. And an executive, either one, can't afford the potential criminal risk, but also can't afford the reputational risk of being dragged through the mud.
It will give you the
with
documents that you need. So this is going to
be
be ballroom heaven, right? Every company that donated to the ballroom will be brought to Capitol Hill to answer questions.
I think there could be some over the ballroom, although the ballroom is a much more traditional. You see companies contribute to various projects over time.
They're going to want to know what they got for it, though.
I think when you look at some of the things that are more concerning to Democrats, look at the crypto deals that you've seen at World Liberty Financial.
I was going to say, there's a big confab going on today while you and I are talking in Palm Beach. You've got the head of Goldman Sachs down there. Does David Solomon get an invite?
I don't know. I mean, members of Congress are going to have to make those decisions. But you've seen alleged transactions that are enriching members of the Trump family, enriching members of the Witkoff family. When you look at law firms who back last year, in the spring of last year, agreed to the president's demands, Democrats have made clear they want to know what the law firms have given up in exchange for that, what kind of services they're providing to the executive branch, if any. They have all these different initiatives they've said they want to probe, and they want to do it very aggressively.
Media companies, you just mentioned what's gone on at CBS. In the last 48 hours could be a field day.
CBS could be a field day. You've seen Democrats raise questions about ABC settling a lawsuit that put money into the president's pocket when every libel lawyer told you that they could win that lawsuit easily. This is something that happened back in the very early days of the administration. And of course, the way that Paramount settled the lawsuit over 60 Minutes, one that they, again, according to libel and defamation lawyers, would have won hands down, but said they chose to settle at a time when they had transaction interests that were before the executive branch. All of those things Democrats want to look into.
Fascinating. With that said, how far do these go beyond the hearing room? And to what extent, you mentioned reputational damage, to what extent can it go further than that if you've still got a Republican White House at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue?
Well, the thing, two things about that. First, the reputational damage is real,
Yeah.
and it's not just the hearing, although having a CEO come down and have to testify is the biggest escalation thing that's most damaging to a company. But the process of turning over documents, many of which can be embarrassing, if not criminal or if not showing actual wrongdoing, can be hugely embarrassing. And unlike when you turn over documents to the executive branch and they generally keep those private, the Congress has no incentive to do that, and usually they don't. So there's a massive reputational cost. And then when it comes to actual cost beyond that, I think one of the things that Democrats believe is that corporate America has behaved as if there's never going to be a change in power, either on the Hill or potentially in the executive branch.
Right.
And of course, that's not true. And the statute of limitations when it comes to criminal behavior, and this is not to say that most, if any of these corporate activities are criminal behavior, but if the Democrats were able to expose actual criminal behavior, the statute of limitations for those types of crimes runs beyond the extent of Trump's 4-year term.
Spending time with Matt Miller from Vianovo on balance of power. Bloomberg government talked to Dan Goldman earlier this month about potential oversight targets. Producer James just put this in front of me. A new Air Force One plane from Qatar, Trump family involvement with crypto you mentioned, energy companies' knowledge of the early January Venezuela military operation. That in itself could be quite a saga.
Yeah, it absolutely could. I'm a little skeptical that the oil companies actually knew anything about that.
Really?
They seem to be completely surprised. Look, I don't think I'm going out on a limb here to say that lots of times the things that the president said, it was the president who said that he'd talk to the oil companies. Yeah. Sometimes he's a little over his skis and says things that aren't exactly accurate. I'd be surprised if they had any real detail. Although it wouldn't surprise me if the administration consulted with him and said, what are the conditions under which you would be willing to come back in and invest in Venezuela? So of course those are things that the Congress might look at.
I want to go back to your time behind the podium for a moment at the State Department, because this is a very different political world that we're living in. And before you joined us, we were talking about talks to potentially end the war in Ukraine that you spent a heck of a lot of time working on in the Biden administration, and the potential for strikes against Iran. This David Sanger column has my attention this morning that's talking about the duo at the tip of the spear here is Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Neither of them are diplomats. Are they the two men who can prevent a war in Iran and end one in Ukraine?
So I have never been concerned about the fact that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner lead negotiations. I think there's no reason that you can't have someone from outside government come in and lead a negotiating team and get results. What has always concerned me, however, is the fact that they have conducted most of these negotiations without any support from experienced diplomats. Yeah. And the problem when you come into that situation is you don't know what you don't know. So when Steve Witkoff goes to Russia and meets with Putin, sometimes one-on-one, in the first case, without even having an American translator in the room, let alone a seasoned American diplomat, and Putin unleashes this spiel that he has about decades of grievances from the West, decades of grievances from Ukraine, Witkoff doesn't know the back and forth. And at times, you heard him come out and then repeat some of Putin's. You heard him do this in a Tucker Carlson interview afterwards, where he came out and repeated some of Putin's propaganda. He clearly didn't know that some of it wasn't true. That is actually dangerous because you're not in a position to negotiate from a level playing field. And that doesn't make sense for the United States, that you wouldn't go in with all the benefit of decades of experience in the United States government of dealing with Putin, of dealing with Russian diplomats, of dealing with Iranian diplomats and Iranian interests, that you wouldn't go in with some of that experience in your back pocket to advise you on what's possible and what's not.
This column headlines, Trump bets on diplomacy without diplomats, reads that some Russians have taken to calling the duo Witkoff and Zayatkoff because Zayat is Russian for son-in-law. The Iranians also have a nickname for Mr. Kushner, using the Persian word for son-in-law, Damad Trump, again defining Kushner's influence by virtue of his marriage to the president's daughter, Ivanka. That is incredible. In our remaining moment, how important is it that we are not getting official readouts on many of these meetings?
It's extremely important, and it's not just important that we, the public, aren't getting readouts. From what I hear from talking to people inside the government, other senior national security officials aren't getting readouts of what's happening in these meetings. They're held in a very tight circle, which again can be okay if you're making progress and you need to do it. But there is not a give and take between the people doing the negotiating and the people inside the government who could advise them on what's true and what's not.